Declan, are you there? Declan! God damn it, Declan! What is that? Oh shit!
So today I'm going to talk about Moons of Madness. This is a newish horror game. It's been out for a while on PC, but it is new to PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. It comes to us from Funcom, and right up front I will say it can be very difficult to do videos on horror games without giving away plot points, especially when the horror game is entirely narrative driven like Moons of Madness is. So what I've done is I've basically captured footage from the first hour of the game where there's not too many revelations and not too much given away, so that I'm not spoiling the key moments for people who want to play this game. But it does mean that this footage is not entirely representative of what the game offers. It is basically a walking simulator in that you are following a trail of narrative breadcrumbs from start to finish, but there are quite a few puzzles, nothing too complex, but puzzles nonetheless. There are stealth sections, there's the occasional monster to run away from. The one you saw at the start of this video was the first monster you come across. But yeah, basically it is a follow the narrow path and follow the narrative threads kind of game. As we've seen with Funcom in the past, they produced the rather excellent The Park previously, and it was because of that game that I was really keen on trying this one out when the development team, or the publisher behind The Park, promises me a Lovecraftian space game. It's a very exciting thing. Unfortunately, this game doesn't quite deliver on its promise, and that's the reason I wanted to do this video, to really discuss why I think a lot of game developers miss the mark when it comes to Lovecraft. But it is still an interesting enough game. It has some nice atmosphere, and I will have a review up on digitallydownloaded.net as well, so you can check that out and get my full thoughts on the game as a whole. So the first thing I want to say about Lovecraft is that his horror doesn't really lend itself well to visual mediums like video games or films. Lovecraft's sense of horror was such that his creatures, his cosmic beings, which he was most famous for creating, were so alien and otherworldly that just being in their presence would be enough to send you mad. And that was quite scary, because it represented this undeniable loss of control. There was nothing you could fight back against, and for the reader it was really kind of an intense experience, because Lovecraft never actually described the creatures that were sending people mad. He just showed the effect of them, because if you think about it, there's nothing that could really... you can't put into words something of such complete terror that every single reader would have the same response. You've always got to, if you're going to describe a monster, you've got to describe what is kind of frightening to you, and then hope that the audience goes along for the ride with you. Whereas with Lovecraft, by only describing the impact that these creatures had, the audience was left to visualize the monster in their own terms, and that always led them down some, pretty horrific paths. And that's why he was such an effective horror writer, and racist bastard as he was, he's still very, influential with horror writers today. That's where his impact comes from. But video game developers really struggle with that, because how do you convert that sense of terror in the unseen into a medium where people are used to pointing and shooting at an ugly monster? And that's horror. And I think that's where the developers of Moons of Madness really struggled. Moons of Madness, as a title, refers to At the Mountains of Madness, which is Lovecraft's longest book from memory. I think it's a fairly long book. It's not really a book, it's a novella, but it was his longest piece of writing. And it very much epitomizes a lot of what Lovecraft's sense of horror and mystery was. And this game takes that as a reference, but then just kind of throws tentacle monsters at you. And while it's overtly Lovecraftian, we all recognize kind of tentacle monsters from outer space as being a Lovecraftian thing, it doesn't really capture the essence or the soul of what made Lovecraft such an effective horror writer. The other big issue I have with this game is it is so heavily reliant on jump scares to really catch the player's attention and keep them kind of awake while they're playing. Every time you would open a door, you get to the point where you're just assuming that something would kind of flash past your vision range, accompanied with one of those, sharp sounds, or there'd be like a flash of lightning or darkness, and then something would briefly appear and disappear on the way to the point where you would find some kind of monster, and then you'd have a long extended sequence where you need to avoid that monster or do something about it. But jump scares don't really suit with the Lovecraftian ideal either. Lovecraft was one of the... Before Lovecraft, horror writers were definitely about the kind of the monster, the grotesque, and a very raw, primitive fear about something that was, powerful and dangerous. If you look at the likes of Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, whatever, those horror were all about... Well, they worked for the concept of jump scares because it was about a physical threat. But again, Lovecraft isn't really about the physical threat. These monsters are, of course, a physical threat because they're, alien beings of incredible power. But they never really got around to killing people because they were too busy sending people mad instead. So the jump scare doesn't work for that kind of psychological style horror, which is Lovecraft's tone. And what you have as a result with Moons of Madness is this weird thing where they try to fit cosmic horror of a Lovecraftian style into the narrative and into the scenes. I mean, setting the game on Mars is just perfect for that kind of isolation and the sense of, spaceness, for want of a better term. All of that works for Lovecraft, but then you have this obsession with stupid jump scares and monsters and flashes of movement and those kinds of shock responses. Tonally, it doesn't work. It just keeps shifting what this game feels like it wants to be back and forth, and you end up getting stuck somewhere in the middle, and it doesn't really say anything or do anything as a result. The final issue that I have with this game is that it is very artificial. This doesn't have to do so much with the Lovecraftian thing, but rather just the way that it structures itself to a point where it loses the impact that it would have otherwise had, because it just becomes hard to suspend disbelief over. The basic idea is that you're quite alone in this game, and space horror generally relies on that feeling of isolation. In space no one can hear you scream and so on and so forth. That isolation, that sense of isolation, gets lost when the game is so obsessed with making you be on your own, but at the same time you're talking to other characters, and the narrative keeps coming up with increasingly more contrived reasons for why you're not meeting these other characters, why you never actually physically see them or interact with them. And it just breaks the immersion within the narrative because it's so obvious that the development team just didn't want to put other characters in the space, but they still needed those characters there to explain the narrative or to push it along, or to give you, your character some kind of personality, because by himself he's quite a dull person. His personality comes from his conversations with the other characters. So those contrivances really kind of pull down on the narrative and make it feel like it's a project that wasn't thought out perhaps as well as it could have been. It loses its atmosphere a bit because of that, and I mean, it's by no means terrible, it's just not... Horror is a difficult genre. Horror is a really, really difficult genre to kind of nail, because it's very difficult to create that intensity, that sense of fear, that sense of that kind of depth of tapping into the human soul and really reflecting something about us all in the process. And it's very hard to do that without tipping over the line to become quite silly in one way or another. And I think this game, unfortunately, it has all the right ideas, but they don't come together in a way that's particularly cohesive or scary. This is not a very scary horror game either. And all of this is disappointing because the park is basically everything that I like in a horror game, and I thought it was quite smart, well written, well structured, and well designed. It was much shorter, it was much more intense, its themes were much cleaner, and it did a much better job of avoiding feeling artificial. This one it's a bigger scale project, but it's just not quite there. Now, with all of that said, there is plenty to like about this game as well, and I do think people who like their walking simulator horrors will find something to enjoy about this one. If you enjoyed Layers of Fear, or Observer, or Blair Witch game, the Bloober team's work, if you enjoyed the park itself, you will find moments of this one where it works. For one thing, it is a very attractive game. They've done a really good job in building a Mars environment which looks sufficiently hostile, feels sufficiently hostile, and the jump scares and all that kind of stuff that they do stick in there, structurally it works. They've got a good sense over the timing so that they launch into those jump scares at just the right moment to catch you unaware, and you do end up jumping. So structurally that stuff works. There's a good sense of how horror is formed, and the monsters, as you would have seen before from that first clip at the start of this video, they're pretty visually impressive. It's not exactly what I wanted from what the game promised to be, but I certainly appreciated the creative work that went into those monster designs. So anyway, that's enough of this video. Thank you as always for watching. Please do read my review on digitallydownloaded.net, which will go into, I guess, the game itself in more depth rather than just talk about one particular element of what the developers are trying to do. If you do enjoy my videos, please do like and subscribe, and you'll get to watch all of them as I do them. And if you do enjoy my videos, please consider backing me on Patreon, because that will help me do a lot more of them in the future. Thanks as always for watching, and we will see you at the next video.
Rise and shine, folks.
Is everybody okay?
I almost spilled my coffee.